Dakota Territory, late summer of 1887. Johan Nilsson was building his house wrong. Every man in the settlement knew it. They saw it with their own eyes. He wasn't building a fireplace against the wall, a great stone hearth to roar and spit defiance at the coming winter. Instead, in the very center of his small, one-room cabin, he was assembling a monster. A slow, hulking column of fieldstone clay and salvaged brick that rose from the dirt floor like some ancient, forgotten altar. Men riding past would rein in their horses, watching him work. They saw him lay channels of brick that seemed to go nowhere. They saw him create passages that, impossibly, snaked downwards. He wasn't building a chimney, he was building a maze for smoke, an upside-down absurdity that defied 1,000 years of common sense. The jokes started at the trading post, quiet at first, then louder. They called it Nilsson's Folly. Some took to calling it the Rock Pile. They said the Swede was building his own tombstone right in the middle of his living space. What did this quiet immigrant, a man with calloused hands and a tongue still clumsy with English, understand about heat and survival that every seasoned trapper, farmer, and builder in the territory had missed? He was building a chimney that drew its heat down, pulling warmth back into the earth instead of letting it rush to the sky. And in that simple, radical act, he was preparing for a winter that would break everyone who thought they knew better. The problem was the cold. Not just cold, but a living, predatory thing. The Dakota winter was a beast that hunted the careless and the unprepared. It was a pressure, a constant physical force that sought every crack, every seam, every moment of inattention. The settlers fought it with the only tools they knew, wood and fire. Their cabins were monuments to a brutal logic. Thick logs, chinked with mud and moss, formed the walls. At one end stood the hearth, a massive fireplace of river stone, wide enough to take a 4-foot log. This was the heart of the home, the center of life. And it was a catastrophic failure. The fire roared, a dazzling, hungry spectacle. It toasted the faces of those who sat before it, while their backs remained numb with cold. It created a zone of comfort, perhaps 6 feet deep. Beyond that, the cabin was a landscape of Arctic misery. Water buckets by the door were solid ice by morning. Ink froze in its wells. At night, families slept buried under a mound of every blanket and pelt they owned, their breath crystallizing into a fine rime on the wool. The flaw was not in the fire, but in its physics. The great hearth was also a great engine of suction. The column of rising hot air in the chimney acted as a powerful siphon, pulling the very warmth it created up and out of the house. To feed this siphon, cold outside air was drawn in through 1,000 invisible gaps, around the doorframe, through the chinking, between the floorboards. The harder the fire burned, the more cold air it pulled in to replace the warmth it was throwing away. It was a war of attrition, and the settlers were losing. A cabin might burn through half a cord of wood in a single week of deep cold, turning the man of the house into a full-time lumberjack, his days consumed by the relentless algebra of chopping and hauling just to keep his family from freezing. They were living inside a paradox, a machine that produced incredible heat and incredible cold at the very same time. This was the reality every settler accepted. It was the price of survival on the plains. They built their fires bigger, chopped their wood faster, and endured. But Johan Nilsson had not grown up with this kind of fire. His memory of warmth was different. He was born in the rolling hills of Västergötland, a region of Sweden where winters were long and timber was not something to be squandered. He had not been a farmer, but an apprentice, a kakelungsmakare, a tile stove maker. In the great houses and modest manners of his homeland, the hearth was not a gaping maw that devoured forests. It was a towering, elegant column of ceramic tile, a kakelon. These magnificent structures were not fireplaces. They were thermal batteries. A small, hot fire of birch logs would be burned for an hour or two in the morning. The smoke did not rush straight up a chimney. Instead, it was forced through a labyrinth of internal channels, winding its way up, down, and sideways, through 5 or 6 passes inside the stove's massive brick core. By the time the smoke finally exited the chimney, it was cool to the touch, having surrendered more than 80% of its heat to the masonry. That stored energy then radiated out into the room, a gentle, pervasive warmth that lasted for 12, sometimes 24 hours. Johann had spent his youth learning the secrets of flue design, the precise angles needed to coax smoke against its nature, the perfect mixture of clay and sand for mortar that could withstand decades of expansion and contraction. He didn't just understand fire. He understood heat exchange, thermal mass, and the science of capturing energy before it could escape. When he arrived in Dakota Territory and saw the American fireplace for the first time, he was appalled. He saw not a source of comfort, but a machine for wasting wood and sucking in the cold. He saw men working themselves to exhaustion to feed a monster that gave them almost nothing in return. He knew, with an unshakable certainty forged in the workshops of the old country, that there was a better way, and he would build it, right in the center of his new life. The foundation was a square of packed earth and stone 10 feet on a side, dominating the middle of the cabin. On this, Johann began to build. He used field stone for the core, rocks his own hands had pulled from the prairie soil, chosen for their density and shape. He used precious brick, salvaged from a failed kiln, for the delicate interior work, the firebox, and the flue channels. His mortar was not the simple mud the others used for their chimneys. It was a precise mixture of local clay, sand, and ash, a recipe he held in his head. The structure grew slowly. It had none of the rustic charm of a riverstone hearth. It was a brute, a blocky, utilitarian mass that seemed to consume the limited space of the cabin. His wife Anna moved around it with a quiet faith, trusting the memory of warmth he was trying to recreate. One afternoon, Silas Croft appeared in the doorway. Silas was the closest thing the settlement had to an authority on construction. He had built the church, the trading post, and more than a dozen of the sturdiest cabins in the county. He was a man whose experience had been earned through frozen winters and collapsed roofs. He was respected, and his word carried weight. He watched Johann for a long time, his brow furrowed. He saw the firebox, low and small. He saw the first channel rising from it. But then he saw the baffling turn, the place where Johann was building a path for the smoke to travel back down. He finally broke the silence. "Nielsen," he said, his voice not unkind. "That won't draw, you know that, don't you?" Johann paused, a brick in his hand. He looked at Silas, then at his work. "It will draw," he said simply. Silas stepped inside, gesturing with a thick finger. "Smoke wants to go up. It's in its nature. You try to force it down, and it will find the easiest path. And that path will be right back into this room. You'll choke your wife and children on soot. The first flue is tall. The fire will be hot. The draft will be strong enough," Johann replied, his English careful and deliberate. "It will pull the cooler smoke behind it." Silas shook his head, a deep frustration in his eyes. He was trying to save this man from himself. "Even if you don't kill yourselves with smoke, look at this thing. It's 5 tons of stone. In winter, that stone will be a block of ice. The little fire you're building in there won't be enough to warm the stone, let alone the room. That mass will suck every bit of heat you make. It will bleed you dry. You'll be colder in here than you would be outside." It was a perfectly logical argument, based on a lifetime of experience with conventional fireplaces. Place the brick he was holding carefully. Place the brick he was holding carefully onto its bed of clay mortar. He looked at the mountain of rock he was building, and a faint smile touched his lips. "The stone will not be the enemy," he said, more to himself than to Silas. "The stone will remember the fire." Silas Croft left that day convinced the Swede was a stubborn fool, and a dangerous one at that. He told the men at the trading post about the conversation, about the downward chimney and the mad theory of a heat-sucking rock pile. His expert opinion solidified the community's view. Johan Nilsson was not just eccentric, he was a menace to his own family. The name Nilsson's Folly stuck. The mockery became a constant low-grade hum in their lives. When Anna went to the post for supplies, she felt the women's stares, a mixture of pity and disapproval. Men would ride by the cabin and shout jests. "Hey, Nilsson, have you taught that smoke to read a map yet?" Another yelled, "Don't come to us for wood when your rock pile freezes you out." Johan never responded. He kept building. He finished the intricate S-shaped flue system inside the stone mass. The path was ingenious in its simplicity. Hot gas and smoke erupted from the firebox into a primary rising channel, getting the powerful upward draft started. At the top of the stove, this channel was capped, forcing the gases to split into two smaller flues that ran down the outer sides of the structure. This was the crucial counterintuitive step. As the gases descended, they were forced into close contact with the bricks and stones, surrendering their heat through conduction. At the very bottom, near the floor, the two channels merged again and entered the final flue, which ran up through the center of the mass and out the roof. By the time the exhaust left the chimney, it had traveled nearly 30 feet and was little more than a lukewarm vapor. The heat, the precious energy from the wood, had been trapped. It was now owned by the stone. When he was finished, he covered the rough stone with a thick plaster of clay and sand, giving it a smooth, clean finish. He installed a small cast-iron door on the firebox. It was not a fireplace. It was a sealed system, an engine for capturing heat. The community saw a dumb, ugly block of masonry. Johan saw a battery. He had not built a simple heater. He had built a reservoir. He had built a system that stored the ferocious, fleeting energy of a fire and transformed it into a slow, steady, and enduring warmth. The fire would burn for an hour, but the stone would remember and radiate that memory back into the room for the rest of the day. Now, all he had to do was wait for the winter to prove him right. Then, December came. The cold arrived as it always did, tentatively at first, then with a sudden, iron-fisted grip. The land hardened, the river froze, and the season of struggle began. In the cabins of the settlement, the fireplaces were lit, and the ceaseless consumption of wood commenced. January of 1888 began with a deceptive mildness. A thaw, they called it. The temperature hovered just above freezing. But on the morning of January 12th, the sky turned a strange, ominous shade of gray. The temperature, which had been a pleasant 34 degrees at dawn, began to fall. By noon, it was 10 degrees. By sunset, it read -4. The wind began to rise, a low moan from the northwest. This was not a normal cold front. This was something else. This was the arrival of the beast. The blizzard hit without warning. It was not a snowstorm. It was a vertical explosion of white. The air itself seemed to transform into a blinding, scouring torrent of ice crystals. The temperature plunged into a free fall. -10, -20. The wind rose to a gale, then a hurricane-force shriek. The settlers, caught completely by surprise, scrambled for their homes. This was the storm that would later be known as the school children's blizzard, a legendary event that killed hundreds across the plains. For the settlers in Johann's community, it was simply the ultimate test. Inside the cabins, a desperate battle was underway. The fireplaces, which had seemed so robust, were now revealed as hopelessly inadequate. They roared day and night, their masters feeding them a steady diet of oak and ash. But the storm's cold was overwhelming. The wind drove it through the walls, through the chinking, down the massive chimneys themselves. Families abandoned all pretense of normal life. They dragged their mattresses and blankets to the floor directly in front of the hearth, creating a small island of survivable warmth in a sea of deadly cold. The men took turns staying awake, feeding the fire, knowing that if it went out, they would all be in mortal danger. The wood piles, which had seemed so large a week before, were vanishing at a terrifying rate. Panic began to set in. Silas Croft was in his own cabin, the one he considered the finest in the settlement. Every log was perfectly scribed, every joint tight. His stone fireplace was a masterpiece of dry stack construction, and it was failing him. He stood before the fire, the heat scorching his face. Yet he could feel the cold seeping up from the floorboards, crawling down his spine. His wife and 3 children were huddled under a mountain of quilts on the floor behind him. The interior walls were coated in a thick layer of frost. He had already burned a day's worth of wood in just a few hours. The sound of the wind outside was not a whistle. It was a physical roar, a continuous, deafening assault that made the entire cabin shudder. He was a master builder, an expert in the craft of shelter, and his expertise was useless. The cold was mocking him, pouring into the very home he had built to defy it. His certainty, his lifetime of proven knowledge, was turning to ash along with the logs in his fireplace. And then, a thought pierced his fear. A thought that filled him with a sudden chilling shame. Nielsen, the Swede. The fool with the rock pile and the upside-down chimney, he had 2 small children in that cabin. Silas pictured the place with its tiny firebox and that massive, cold-sucking monument of stone. They had no chance. The folly would have become their tomb. A wave of guilt washed over him. He had laughed along with the others. He had offered his expert condemnation and then walked away. He hadn't just predicted failure, he had wished for it, in a way. He had wanted the stubborn immigrant to be proven wrong, to validate the collective wisdom of the community. What if that pride had just condemned a family to death? He had to know. He had to go. If you've ever faced a challenge that made you question everything you thought you knew, hit that like button right now. What Johann Nielsen did next wasn't just about survival. It was about proving that a single, well-understood principle can be more powerful than a century of tradition. Stay with me, because the proof was about to walk through the door. Pulling on every layer of wool and canvas he owned, Silas wrapped a scarf over his face until only his eyes were exposed. He told his wife he was going to check on the Nielsens. She begged him not to go, but the look in his eyes told her it was no use. He tied a rope from his door to the corner of his barn, and from there to the fence line that led in the general direction of the Nielsen cabin. Without it, he would be lost and dead in seconds. The journey was less than 300 yards, but it was the most harrowing trip of his life. The wind was a solid thing, a wall of ice and motion that knocked him to his knees. The air was so cold it burned his lungs with every breath. He couldn't see more than his own hands in front of his face. He navigated by feel, his mittened hands tracing the rough wood of the fence posts, one after another, a rosary of survival in the white chaos. He thought he was lost a dozen times. Finally, his outstretched hand hit not a fence post, but the solid log wall of a cabin. Nielsen's. He stumbled along the wall, searching for the door, his mind bracing for what he would find inside. He imagined them huddled, frozen, a silent monument to a fool's pride. He found the door, drifted over with snow, and pounded on it with his fist, shouting Johann's name, his voice swallowed by the storm. For a moment there was nothing. Then he heard the scrape of a bar being lifted from inside. The door swung inward, and Silas Croft was hit by a wave of warmth. It was not the scorching, dry heat of a fireplace. It was a gentle, steady, room-filling warmth. It was like stepping from the dead of winter into a late spring afternoon. The air was soft, humid, and alive. He stumbled inside, pulling the scarf from his face, his eyes trying to adjust. The scene that greeted him was one of impossible, defiant domesticity. Anna Nilsson was at a large wooden table, humming softly as she kneaded a ball of dough for bread, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. On the floor, playing with carved wooden animals, were her two children, Lars and Elin. They were barefoot. Silas stared, his mind refusing to process the information. Barefoot. In the middle of the worst blizzard in living memory. He looked for the fire. He expected to see a furnace, a roaring inferno devouring logs. He saw nothing. Then Johann, who had opened the door, gestured toward the massive stone structure in the center of the room. The small iron door to its firebox was closed. There was no roar, no crackle, no visible flame. A kettle of water sat on the flat top surface of the stove, letting out a gentle plume of steam. Silas, the builder, the man of practical things, took over. His shock gave way to a desperate need to understand. He walked the perimeter of the room. He ran his bare hand along the inside of the north wall, the wall that bore the full brunt of the storm. In his own cabin, that wall was a sheet of ice. Here it was cool, yes, but it was dry. There was no frost. He looked at the single-pane windows. They were clear, with only a small amount of condensation at the bottom. He approached the central stove, Nilsson's folly, as if it were a living thing. He placed his palm flat against the clay plaster. It was not hot. It was deeply, profoundly warm, a steady, radiating heat that seemed to penetrate to his very bones. It was the warmth of a sun-baked stone on a summer day. He could feel the immense thermal energy stored within it. He turned to Johann, his voice a hoarse whisper. "What is this?" "It is a stove," Johann said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "The fire? Where is the fire?" Silas asked, still bewildered. Johann opened the small iron door. Inside, a small bed of embers glowed peacefully. There were no active flames. The fire was nearly out. The full impossibility of the situation crashed down on Silas. A dying fire, a warm house, barefoot children. It defied every law of nature as he knew it. There had to be a catch. There had to be a cost. "How much wood have you burned?" he asked, his voice sharp with disbelief. "You must be burning a whole forest in this thing." Johann pointed to a small wooden box against the wall. It was not a woodshed. It was a simple crate, the kind used for shipping dry goods. It was still more than 3/4 full. "I made a fire this morning, for 1 hour," Johann said, "and one last night, 2 small loads. That is all." Silas stared at the wood box, then back at the serene, warm room. He thought of his own voracious fireplace, of the mountain of wood he had already consumed, of the back-breaking labor that went into it, all for a result that was an icy hell compared to this. He did the quick, frantic math in his head. The Nilssons were achieving 10 times the comfort with less than 1/10 of the fuel. He fumbled in his coat pocket and pulled out the brass-cased pocket thermometer he used in his work. He hung it from a peg on the wall, away from the stove. The men watched in silence as the mercury slowly settled. Silas leaned in to read the small markings. It registered 68 degrees Fahrenheit. 68 degrees. He knew with a certainty that made him feel sick that the temperature in his own cabin was struggling to stay above 40. and that was with a fire that threatened to burn the chimney down. Outside, the temperature was now at least 25 below zero, with a wind chill that was likely double that. A 90-degree differential, maintained for hours by a handful of logs. The numbers were undeniable. The proof was in the air he was breathing, in the barefoot children on the floor, in the lazy steam rising from the kettle. Silas Croft, the most respected builder in the territory, the man of experience and tradition, turned to face Johan Nilsson, the quiet immigrant, the foolish Swede. The arrogance was gone from his face, stripped away by the raw power of the evidence before him. In its place was something new, a profound, earth-shattering humility. He looked at Johan, then at the magnificent stove, and then back at Johan. He opened his mouth and the words came out, heavy with the weight of a lifetime of certainty being demolished in a single moment. "I was wrong," Silas said, his voice clear and steady. "I was completely and utterly wrong. This is not a folly. This is genius. You must teach me how to build this. You must teach us all." When the great blizzard of '88 finally broke, the settlers emerged from their homes into a world of deep drifts and profound silence. The stories began to circulate. Tales of hardship, of livestock lost, of families who had burned their furniture just to stay alive. But another story began to spread, a story that sounded like a tall tale, the story of the Nilsson cabin. It was Silas Croft who told it first, and he told it with the zeal of a convert. He described the wave of warmth, the barefoot children, the impossible efficiency of the stove. He was the community's most credible witness, and his testimony could not be ignored. The mockery surrounding Nilsson's folly died overnight. It was replaced by a sense of awe and then by a desperate curiosity. Men began to visit the Nilsson cabin not to jeer, but to learn. They would stand in the small, warm room, place their hands on the stone, and shake their heads in wonder. Johan, who had withstood their ridicule with quiet stoicism, now met their curiosity with quiet generosity. He explained the principles to them. He drew diagrams in the dirt with a stick, showing the S-shaped path of the flue. He explained that the secret was not a bigger fire, but a slower exit for the smoke. It was about giving the heat time to surrender itself to the stone. Silas Croft became his most dedicated student and his greatest champion. That spring, he announced he was building a new stove for his own cabin, and he asked Johan to supervise. Together, they built the second masonry stove in the territory. Silas, with his deep knowledge of stonework, and Johan, with his specialized understanding of thermal dynamics, made a formidable team. When it was finished, Silas officially named the design. "We're going to call it a Nilsson stove," he declared, over Johan's humble protests. The name stuck. That summer, 3 more were built. The next year, a dozen more. The open, inefficient American fireplace, once the unassailable heart of the frontier home, began to disappear from new construction in that part of the territory. The central Nilsson stove became the new standard, the mark of a well-built, winter-proof home. The entire architecture of the cabins began to change. Instead of being built long and thin with a fireplace at one end, new homes were designed as squares, built around the central thermal mass of the stove, allowing the heat to radiate evenly to all corners. The transformation of the community was profound. The tyranny of the woodpile was broken. The endless, exhausting work of chopping and hauling was reduced by 80, sometimes 90%. But the real impact was measured in far more than cords of wood or degrees of temperature. It was measured in human dignity. It was measured in a baby surviving its first winter without the constant threat of respiratory illness from a cold, drafty cabin. It was measured in a family being able to use their entire home in January, not just a 6-foot patch of floor by a ravenous fire. It was measured in the quiet security of knowing that when the next great blizzard came, their homes would be sanctuaries of warmth, not fragile fortresses under siege. Johan Nielsen never sought fame or fortune for his contribution. He never patented his design or charged for his advice. He remained a quiet farmer, a man who had simply wanted to keep his own family safe. His satisfaction came from seeing the plume of clean, cool smoke rising from a neighbor's chimney, knowing that inside that home, another family was warm. His name became attached to the method organically, a testament to the man who taught smoke to run downhill, and in doing so, changed everything. The story of Johan Nielsen and his backward chimney is a powerful reminder that sometimes the most profound innovations come not from celebrated inventors, but from quiet outsiders who carry a different kind of knowledge. It illustrates the conflict between entrenched tradition and empirical truth, and the courage it takes to trust what you know in the face of universal ridicule. The most arrogant stance we can take is to dismiss what we do not understand. True wisdom begins with the humility to admit, as Silas Croft did, that we might be wrong. The principles Johann brought from the old world are more relevant today than ever. His masonry stove was a masterpiece of passive heat technology, a concept that lives on in modern high-efficiency heaters, rocket mass heaters, and passive solar design. They all share the same fundamental goal: to capture and store energy intelligently, rather than wastefully consuming fuel. It's a lesson about working with nature, not simply trying to overwhelm it with brute force. If this story about forgotten frontier wisdom made you think, hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of lost engineering and practical genius. And drop a comment below telling me about the most clever, low-tech solution to a problem you've ever encountered. I'd love to hear about it. The story you have just heard is a fictionalized account created for educational and entertainment purposes. While the engineering principles of contraflow masonry heaters, or Russian fireplaces, are very real and historically significant, the characters, specific events, and locations depicted are products of creative storytelling. This narrative is intended to illustrate a powerful technical concept and should not be taken as a literal historical record or as professional construction advice.